So good morning, everybody. So I'll be, leading off this session, exploring. I guess this is more of an exploratory type of track session. I think looking at that idea of sustainability, and the idea kind of came from conversations that we've had with stakeholders in the industry, and a lot of the takeaway from those conversations is that there was no clear understanding or definition of what sustainability really means. And then the definition really changed depending on the context you found yourself in. And because of that, we felt like there was some need to dive into this and maybe start to parse through some of the various pieces of the puzzle to try to figure out what sustainability might mean, but also what are the potential implications. I think one of the biggest concerns we had was who pays the bill for this nebulous term of sustainability, and is it all going to fall on the farmer? And as part of what I'm going to be exploring a little bit from kind of a high level overview, looking down at all the moving pieces that make up this segment. So I guess to lead off, it's no secret to most of us that the term sustainability has been used more and more in specific contexts of sustainable development and growing our production systems and growing our economies in a more sustainable fashion. And a lot of the increase in mentions of sustainability has come from multiple different fronts. There's been concerns over climate change and global climate patterns. There's been concerns over rising inequality, and we're starting to get into how this word can mean very different things depending on who you're interacting with. Public health has also made the conversation about what sustainable development may mean, and worker safety and reducing worker exploitation has also been part of the conversation for what we mean when we say sustainable development and sustainable economies. And so because of that, consumer preferences, I think, are shaped by a lot of these definitions and a lot of these phrases and words that are out there. And all of that has contributed to this increase in concern, interest in the idea of sustainability. From an agricultural perspective, sustainability has largely focused on the climate impacts of agricultural production. And agriculture right now in the US represents about 11% of climate emissions. And so this has primarily been the dominating definition or focus of climate change, or I should say sustainability, when we're talking about sustainability in the agricultural community. And for the most part, climate change has taken dominated a lot of the conversation. But there's also other factors that are putting pressure or potentially putting pressure on the conversations in agriculture as well. So when we're thinking about food production and consumer products, there's been increased government regulation, or the threat or concern about government regulation. And so in 2021, the European Commission proposed, they had a proposal for using the Corporate Sustainable Reporting Directive, which is essentially formalizing a lot of the ESG definitions of sustainability and using that as sort of an index for rating companies in terms of their sustainability impacts. And so there's also been, from the regulatory side, there's been some sense that investors are going to try to get ahead of the whole, we don't want the regulators to tell us what to do. We're going to try to figure out what works best for us and pass on those definitions to the regulators. So there's been some sense that the investors themselves have been trying to jump on this and get ahead of the market or the regulators so that they're not being imposed with rules that don't really work for them. And so those are some of the investment pressures and the regulatory pressures that have been coming towards the agricultural side, in addition to global warming and some of the other impacts that we're going to get into. There's also been the rise of socially responsible investing the ease of investing today has increased. A lot of people have Robinhood accounts, SoFi, you name your app, and a lot of people are getting into investing, and you can invest in socially responsible ETFs, and there are portfolios of or indexes of funds that exist now that you can use for investing in these kinds of according to these socially responsible metrics. And so all these signals have been going towards placing pressure on suppliers, especially for thinking about what how they can be sustainable and how they can try to take advantage of some of these increases in interest. And there's no question that consumer preferences are going to matter for suppliers and producers. Obviously, the demand from consumers is going to help to drive where producers and suppliers want to take their business and how they want to form their outlooks going forward. Sorry, this is a busy slide. I'm going to move forward. And so what that means is that because of all of these drivers and different areas of focus, the term sustainability has kind of been, it's become a very nebulous term at this point. And it's now really hard to define. And as a result, one of the key things that we're trying to understand here is, can we parse it into different segments? And then we're going to try to figure out how much each of these pieces is going to be affecting the agricultural producer. But also, I think it's also here to elicit or try to figure out what are the key research pieces that are still there to investigate or get involved in when we're looking at sustainability. On the production side, so a lot of the production side I'll be able to isolate, but there are also other sides of this that I think are very interesting. So this is kind of an overview of the key components of what sustainability is today. So there's environmental health components to this. There's economic profitability, there's social and economic equity, and those definitions kind of collide to form the core of what is economic sustainability or sustainability today. And so all these drivers are going to have their critical role in how the agricultural market is going to be impacted. So the food producers are kind of the focus of this piece of the talk. And so the food producers, as we said, are going to face all three of those components. And the key question that we want to figure out is, will the farmers or the food producers foot the bill? Where do they fit into the puzzle, and how much of the bill they're going to face? The reason this question is important is because food production, farming, has generally, according to the 2016 USDA report, commanded about 7.8 cents to the dollar for every dollar that a consumer spends. And so at 7.8 cents, it means that there's only 7.8% of whatever is spent in the agricultural markets that will make it back to the farmer. One question we could ask is, would this be enough to compensate for any changes that the farmer has to make? Because more than likely, there are going to be changes if we're going to go towards sustainable practices. Those are going to involve additional costs. And would 7.8 cents to the dollar be enough to compensate for the changes that the farmers are going to have to make? And number two, how much are consumers willing to pay? How much is that 7.8% going to really be? Is that going to be a very large pie that can be sliced 7.8 cents, and that would still be a quite significant piece of change that would compensate the farmers? And so consumer willingness to pay studies are going to be important for this, but also understanding the dynamics between supplier and producer. Those are going to be important for that. And that means that the particular market segment is going to be sensitive to how they are able to foot the bill for sustainable production. And so will farmers foot the bill? I think it's pretty easy to say that the answer is no. They're not going to be responsible for taking on the entire bill. What we've seen so far, and I'm going to go into what we've seen so far, and the mechanisms that are going to be important for driving adoption of sustainable practices, but also transforming the market so that it becomes more sustainable. And so the short answer is that the farmers are not going to be the primary bearers of the cost of this switch. There's going to have to be a lot that takes place in order for sustainability or sustainable markets to really evolve. So how much will they pick up? That's still an open question. Welcome for research. Many can look into that question of how much the farmers will pay. And the other question here is, how will that be distributed? How will the cost be distributed across the different segments of the market? The taxpayers are going to have some responsibility in this, and we already do have some responsibility in this. There's going to be some pass-through, as we talked about, from the consumers, but I think that technology and market innovation are going to be the key drivers of how this all plays out. And so from the policy directive and the policy response so far has been completely focused on the environmental impacts of food production. So chemical runoff has been a primary concern, erosion management, minimization of eutrophication, and production resilience. Those have all been the key drivers of production to date. I think, there we go. So this has been where most of the policy dollars have been focused. So since, I would say around 2009 or so, there's been a steady increase in government funding towards conservation, and it's increasingly represented a larger portion of total agricultural spending by the government. And that's projected to increase, and you know, the new administration back in 2020, 2 years ago before the world ended, that was one of the key things that they were pointing out, was that they were very committed to continuing to push towards increased agricultural spending in conservation, particularly for cover crops. But policy success so far has been quite limited. There hasn't been a lot of moving the needle in terms of getting farmers to actually adopt these practices. The practices are very, I wouldn't say very expensive, because there are arguments that they're supposed to benefit the farm. The benefits that they are supposed to generate for the farm have been variable. But also there's been also the cost that they have to bear upfront. A lot of the benefits that would accrue to the farm for sustainability are well into the future and don't accrue immediately upon take-up. And so there's been limited adoption, even with government intervention and increased government spending. And so that hasn't really moved the needle on where sustainability, on how sustainable farmers are willing to be. And so there remains a lot of room for other players to take effect. Innovation, I think, is going to be a key player for how all of this plays out. Today, we produce more with less, and that has been one of the leading news points recently, that agricultural land has actually been declining in the last several years, even though we've been producing way more than we have in the past. Increased intensification of production. What that means for global emissions is yet to be seen, but from this graph, it shows that we can at least assume that for the near term, those trends are on the decline, right? And so innovation has been playing a key role in how we're doing with, at least on the emissions side of things. This does not address the other aspects, such as environmental eutrophication, environmental land impacts, and aquatic impacts. But this definitely does speak to the GHG impacts. Sustainable farming technologies have also been increasingly adopted by farmers. The use of improved production systems remains lagging compared to other types of production, but new technology and equipment, those tend to be the leaders in how production is being driven. As we saw, a lot of this has to do with increased efficiency in production, and that has spillover effects in terms of GHG emissions and other types of impacts. But anything that I think is going to make efficient production more likely and reduce costs as a result, those are going to be the first ones that the farmers are going to target, and then other things are going to follow. Policy will have to step in for other impacts. And I think where there are now opportunities for increased revenues for farmers is with climate change incentives, and this one remains controversial. And there's a lot of research that still needs to happen for this area to fully develop. I think this is where I was, well, I think I mixed up the slide here. What this was supposed to focus on was the introduction of new markets such as carbon sequestration markets and the carbon capture, which is a different segment of that market as well. And also selling land for solar and selling land for removal from production for regenerative purposes. So there's agricultural regenerative means, carbon sequestration, and carbon capture. And those are potential markets that farmers will be able to take care of from a policy perspective. The market side of that is interesting as well, because that will involve selling licenses and so on that we haven't really figured out. This is where I was going with that one on the right-hand side. But those markets are yet to be completely fleshed out. Most of them are still in the early stages of development. How you measure carbon sequestration or carbon sequester is a big challenge, and how that will be implemented is still a point of a lot of concern and a rich area for research, I would say. And then finally, kind of handing off the baton, is the factors that are kind of upstream from production. So those will be the signals from the consumers and policymakers, well, investors and consumers, and how those are going to trickle through to producers. So that will involve studies that take into account willingness to pay, but also looking at how do we transmit signals to the consumers that farmers are taking on different practices. So things like indexes will probably be really important. And I think that's where our other speakers are going to have more to say than I currently do on that. So with that, I'll leave it there.
And I think I want to apologize because I said you're from Auburn. You got your PhD at LSU, and you're an architect, right? So,
yeah, I got my PhD at NC State. They're fine.
Any questions?
Just from a kind of a meta question, you're talking about, like, you know, farmer adoption of these practices. You get the sense that the policy making is so on the ag tech side. I get the sense that that people create technologies for farms, that the benefits of that technology are more upstream, but they expect the farmers to adopt it.
Yeah.
Do you get the sense that the policy also, like ag policy, is also kind of mismatched right now, where the ag policies are being developed to benefit the downstream supply chain or you know, processors, or consumers, et cetera, but not specifically targeting farmer adoption the way that they should. Does that make sense?
No, I get what you're saying. I would say that the focus of policy has been on, I'll go back to it. So here has been kind of where a lot of these conservation programs have been focusing. So the Chesapeake Basin area,
Yeah.
or the Chesapeake Bay area, that has been a target-rich environment for agricultural policy, for conservation, cover crops, and so on. There's been local policies as well as federal policies. And a lot of that has been targeted towards, can we reduce runoff toward in nearby streams and waterways? That has been the driver for why these programs have existed. I think the question you're asking is, if we're going to incentivize farmers to adopt these practices, are they taking into account necessarily the on-farm effects at the expense of the...
So like if I'm looking at this map
Mhm.
and I'm a farmer outside Lafayette, how much do I really care about that dead zone?
Right there, you don't at all. It's the farmers in Iowa that are really contributing to
Okay,
that
yeah.
dead zone. Yeah,
Same
Yeah.
concept, right?
yeah, exactly. But as a farmer in that area might be targeted for adoption of these practices, farmers in Iowa are going to be as well. What they've found is that the costs that they're being compensated, whatever they're being compensated to adopt these practices, aren't in line with the benefits they derive from the farm. I don't know if that answers the question, but
So I have a question also, and this is probably more for a general discussion, I think, but when you talk about some of these sustainability practices are currently voluntary, they're market driven in a way.
Mhm.
But you also brought the issue of government regulations, and whenever you introduce regulations, you start thinking about issues related to equity and farm size and how imposing this type of technology adoption. I mean, it was remarkable that the number one adoption in terms of technology was technology. And so
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
costly. And so that brings up these issues about scaling and how is it going to impact different farm sizes.
yeah. No, that's a really good question. And are we moving towards larger and larger farms? And I think this is a very complex issue because there are obviously competing factors. On the one hand, you have, if we're thinking about these conservation practices, the drive there is actually to go towards smaller and smaller farms and being more diverse farms. And you have farms that do a little bit of livestock and a little bit of corn, a little bit of cotton, and they rotate and so on. And that's kind of the driver from that side. On the other side is the technology adoption side, which goes towards GHG emissions. And that is on becoming more efficient at production and using your resources more efficiently. And that limits, as we saw from that graph, that limits GHG emissions. But that means that you would have to operate at significant scale in order for that to be accomplished. There is some complementarity in that we saw that because you're more efficient, you can operate on a smaller size, but I'm sure there is some threshold at which that's no longer going to be viable. So there's kind of this weird complexity, which makes it an economic problem of constrained optimization, because you're getting these competing drivers that pushes one in one direction and you have drivers that push it in the other, is my sense.
That's interesting. Yeah, I guess I have a follow-up question related to the development side. So, true. Efficient technology that we discussed are different to implement. However, in Latin America, many countries have committed to these emissions, right? And many of the technology practices and innovation that really can lead to carbon neutrality farms are usually not that economic profitable. So in that sense, governments are trying to encourage farmers, different groups, right? Regulation. If you go into the specific, you will see that the rice producers, if water is free, if you don't put a tax on the amount of water you're using, then farmers won't have incentive to use water efficiency, and the more water they use, more emissions, right? And if you go to the livestock, farmers will be encouraged to visit farm because that can limit production to a certain extent. So my question is that, so when you put programs like government intervention in which you regulate, let's say the government is giving so many loans and they can request farmers, okay, I'm gonna give you soft loans, however, you have to implement some practices. On the demand side, we are working toward education of consumers so they can pull demand. Or how can we recognize a product that is carbon neutral? So those are things that the government can do. My question is more, so in the US, based on review, so what is government trying to do in order to promote those technologies that we are not that competitive economically?
You mean like the carbon capture technologies, or what type of technology specifically?
No, I'm just
Okay.
thinking about those technologies that maybe are.
So from a general sense, I think there's been kind of a public-private partnership on the, I would say, the nonprofit side of things. So we've seen a lot of grants that have come out that are going towards generating ideas and trying to spur technologies that will try to answer some of the questions that you just asked. On the farmer side, on the farmer adoption side, I think that the current drive right now is to try to create markets that the farmers will be able to take advantage of. And the markets are going to come in a lot of different ways. One of them is through actually selling resources on your land. That could be carbon sequestration, that could be resting your land so that it's not in production. But from the technology adoption side, some of that maybe Trey Malone might get at, where the drive is to now create indexes and things like that that give farms a rating, and then that could be passed on, potentially filtered through to the consumer. My issue with that is that we saw that very little of that is going to come back to the producer. So there might, I still believe that a lot of the push for this is going to come from figuring out how do we create markets at the farm level that are going to directly filter through to the farm. I could be wrong on that. Perhaps technology and innovation through grants and other things are going to play a big role. But then we run into the issues that Marco brought up, where you might be pricing out some farmers. I think because it's a very complex issue, you're going to find some farmers specialize. I do think that small farms are going to have a role to play, because smaller farms are generally more diversified, and they would automatically get very high ratings for their products if we go the index route. And I think larger farmers are going to be able to take advantage of the technology side more so. So we might see a bifurcation of the markets, and how that plays out is my guess.
I think this is a perfect transition
Yeah.
in terms of going from, we see here that there's a lack of consensus into what really sustainability is. And so there have been several efforts, and I think Trey Malone is working on a scale, and this is a perfect transition to go into what is sustainability, and how do we start to put numbers and measuring and comparing how sustainable things are.
Slides get closed.
No, those are mine. Might be this one. Let's go down those. Okay. No, here we go.
Okay, so actually, my conversation about sustainability is a fundamentally different look. So I have been thinking about the supply chain side of things, just like everybody else since 2020, right? Like we had this massive pivot in the grocery stores. And so there were all types of conversations about panicked buying, are you panic buying, anxiety about coronavirus, et cetera. And in the United States, at least, I don't think many of us were used to seeing bare grocery shelves. And so there is this open-ended question about what was going on at that point in time. When I think about like these supply chain motivations, it's got to make sense for a farmer to follow what's going on at the consumer level. So if you go talk to like stakeholders, if I'm talking to a wheat farmer, he's going to tell me, I don't really care what's going on in bread markets, like, because I don't sell bread, I sell wheat to a processor who then sells to a bread maker. And so it's this massive disconnect, but it can create these huge ripple effects. So what was actually going on here, I think more than anything, was this massive pivot from eating at restaurants to eating at home. And so the blue line here is food and beverages purchased for off-premises consumption versus food and service accommodations. So what we're seeing here is this massive gap that started during COVID-19. So it's not clear to me that panic buying was really what was driving those empty grocery store shelves. It was probably in large part due to this huge pivot to exclusively eating from grocery stores as opposed to restaurants. Now, there's also a bunch of wrinkles to that conversation, especially as it relates to urban and rural divides. So rural places in the United States, I think, experienced COVID-19 fundamentally different, not just politically, but also in terms of what the experience in day-to-day life looked like during COVID. So like my family ranch is in Laverne, Oklahoma. The closest full service restaurant to that ranch is like 30 minutes away. So like in cities, the restaurants closed. You couldn't go to the restaurants. In Laverne, the restaurant was always closed. It didn't matter. So like they didn't have that same panicked experience as what the rest of us were going through. They also live in the middle of nowhere. So like they didn't see people the same way. So you had this fundamentally different thing going on. But regardless of what was going on, whether it was panic buying or whatever, there was this wildly unanticipated consumer shift that happened in the United States. We can call it whatever we want. But what it can create is this thing called the Bullwhip Effect. So this is something that's really popular in the supply chain management literature that I don't think many ag economists really talk about much. I think it's probably one of the most important for moving forward in the United States. Let me just illustrate the concept really quick. There is basically this idea that a sudden unexpected change in consumer demand can lead to increasingly large ripple effects down the supply chain. So you also have to understand seasonality, you have to understand business cycles, you have to understand new product introduction, products end of life, unforeseen circumstances. All these things can start with the toilet paper fiasco, right? Y'all remember how like all of a sudden toilet paper was gone, everybody was joking about toilet paper. Y'all really probably understand the true story of what was going on there. It wasn't that people were just hoarding toilet paper, right? It's that you had a shift in locations that people spent their day. So before, everybody was working at the university, and so you had that single ply toilet paper that comes from a fundamentally different supply chain than the Charmin stuff you go to use at home. That pivot left all of the single ply stuff at the university unused, where at the same time, the stuff at home just skyrocketed in terms of demand. And that's a shelf-stable product. So like, yeah, you probably bought extra per trip, but it wasn't like you were using extra. You were just trying to reduce your number of trips to the grocery store. So it doesn't necessarily mean that there was like this panic hoarding. Now there was probably some of it, but there's also an alternative economic story that makes just as much sense. So let's go into the ag side of things. My good friend Dustin wrote this article that I thought was absolutely fantastic about cheese in Ann Arbor. So there's this really high profile, cool sandwich restaurant. So the pandemic starts, European cheese production stops. And the demand for melted cheese at that point in time declined as well because the restaurant in Ann Arbor was closed. So all of these melted cheese restaurants didn't need the cheese anymore. So the restaurants ordered less cheese because they were closed. Well, the recession wasn't as severe as I think we were originally anticipating.
So restaurants didn't have enough cheese on hand when it came time to start restocking their restaurant. And so what ends up happening? Well, that Ann Arbor restaurant is stockpiling melted cheese so that they don't run out next time. You know, if you ever go to like a barbecue joint right now, like their buffalo wings, they were stockpiling buffalo wings. At the beginning of the pandemic, we were swimming in buffalo wings because all of like the March 2020 was like March Madness, you know, opening day for baseball, you know, I mean, all kinds of like sporting events, St. Patrick's Day. And that was anticipated in the supply chain ahead of time. So what's happening now is people are either stockpiling cheese, which to an economist means what's going to happen to prices in some markets, going to decline, and then it creates this bullwhip. So if I'm a producer and I'm trying to just ride along this massive tail, I actually need to understand my customer even more than what I think I do. And so I've been kind of fascinated with this concept for a while, honestly. You know, in extension, I do a lot of consumer marketing stuff, and it takes work to convince some stakeholders that they should care about this. Well, they should, and this is why. What's actually happening right now at Walmart, for example, is they stockpiled on clothing. And so they're having to slash prices on clothing at Walmart so that they can get rid of their warehouse clothing. So it's happening in certain markets already. And I think it's going to continue to happen in the markets that we actually follow closer than clothing. Okay, so the big punchline here is that small unexpected demand changes can lead to this increasing swing down the supply chain. So what I'm trying to argue for is that we need to be focusing more about understanding how consumers feel about the system itself. So are they hoarding? Are they panicked about things? How do they feel about the system? That's what I want to know. There are current indexes that already exist on this. So there's something like they focus on perceptions in the ag economy in a couple, perceptions of consumer sentiments in another couple. But the gap here is, how do consumers feel about ag or agri-food? Does that make sense? I mean, so here's one that like is starting to get at this point. So the Purdue Ag Economy Barometer, I would assume everybody in this room is probably a little bit familiar with it. What they do is they survey ag producers in the United States to get an index value of how they feel about the ag economy at any given time. And Jose, my co-author right here, I had him start making up some figures where we're tracking, like this is a ag economy barometer in the blue, and then the PPI for farm product raw materials. And it traces fairly well. There are some like really weird things that happen in this ag economy barometer. If you'll notice the blue line, which is my ag economy barometer here, election time in 2016, perceptions jumped. Like people were a lot happier in election time 2016. So it's not perfect, right? Like it was not clear why the Trump election should have been such a net positive for perceptions of the ag economy. But these are ag producers talking about ag. You also have banks that are talking about rural businesses, especially agribusinesses. So this is run by Ernie Gross at Creighton. And again, what he's talking to is he sends out an index survey questionnaire to bankers in mostly the Midwest, but rural bankers. And he asks how they feel about things at any given time. And then he traces this over time. The methodologies on these are always kind of a little bit of a wild card. Like what's the number of observations, you know, what kind of questions are you asking, et cetera. Sometimes a little bit unclear. But one survey, so we have the producer side, there are also surveys that are looking at consumers. This is like the OG one. This is the Consumer Sentiment Index from the University of Michigan. It's been ongoing for decades. And it's a survey that they send out that you can find just about anywhere. Like Fred has a really nice mock-up of this, where they're looking at, you know, sentiments about the just overall US economy over time. It's a pretty long questionnaire, but they develop an index out of that questionnaire to try to track this. Notice here that you saw this massive decline in consumer sentiment around COVID times. And yet the CPI doesn't really track that at all. But but it's something else that I think people are trying to at least understand what's going on the consumer end. So the new one, and this was what I originally thought I was going to be working closer on, but then Jason beat me to it, was the Sustainable Food Processing Index. So this is a new Purdue tool that they're pushing out with their Center for Food Demand Analysis and Sustainability. This one, the difference between what I'm talking about and this one, is this sustainability index is looking at how customers are trying to buy more sustainable things. So it's more about like questions regarding, you know, how much more likely this month versus last month are you going to be buying sustainable products, measured a few different ways. This is, I think, a really interesting survey approach. I don't think it moves much. And we published a paper, I published a paper with Alex Schaefer and Jason Lusk last year on egg prices during the pandemic. And what you find is, like, in terms of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, if there's panicking going on somewhere, people kind of just ditch what the price premiums are for the products that they look for. So in that pandemic piece, we found that, like, the premiums for cage-free eggs, for brown eggs, et cetera, all just disappeared during COVID. Like, people, they have kind of these ethical questions, but at the end of the day, they just really need protein. And so this is a valuable index, and I think they're doing a lot of interesting things here. But what I really want to know is I really want to get ahead of what's going on with consumer perceptions of the agri-food system more generally. So Jose and I collected, you know, some pilot data of about 300 observations, 277 observations, where we ran the scale validation. Like I said, I'm not a psychologist, so, like, I'm still learning how scale validation works. But we finished the scale validation where we tried to basically hammer down specific questions to put on an index survey over time. It's our hope that ideally we can use that as some type of a prediction model to try to get ahead at, or at least speak to, the panic buying narratives that end up in the news. You know, I have this minor theory that news articles about panic buying can induce panic buying. And so I would like to at least know when that's happening and where that's happening at any given time. There are certain methodological questions that you really have to think through when you're designing a survey like this. The big one is how much does someone's perception of the food system mirror perceptions of the US economy? You know, in ag econ, I think we love to, like, zero in on ag and food issues, which is great. However, my feeling about my cheeseburger is probably also tied up with my feeling about the world, and vice versa, right? So my feeling about the world is probably also tied up with my feeling about my cheeseburger. And so trying to disentangle those two things is something that is, I think, pretty hard for an index like this. So that's why the scale validation we spent a lot of time surveying people with the questions that already exist in these other indices, creating our own questions, and looking at what the latent variable of this kind of food system sentiment overlaps with other questions in these indexes. The other thing that I think is just a really interesting question is there substantial geographic variation in how people feel about the food system? You know, if you're out in rural America, they'll talk about how people think that a steak comes from Walmart. They don't think about the steak coming from a cow. Does that lead to different perceptions in how the food system works, or trust in the food system? If you're around agriculture, if you're in a rural place, are you going to feel better or worse about the food system in any given time? I think that's just a really interesting question. And I don't really have a good answer for that yet, but that's definitely something I'd like to look into. We're also working on some stuff on rural restaurants. So I've got a project with a few folks at ERS where we're looking at the role of rural restaurants in food security in the United States. There's all these papers about grocery stores in rural places and food security in grocery stores. There's, like, virtually no work on rural restaurants, which I think is absolutely fascinating. But it ties back into this conversation about the sustainability of the food system in terms of what consumers are looking for at any given time. This is a terrible slide, but I just wanted to show you that we have a ton of questions that we're throwing out into this, and we're trying to look at these different correlations across the latent variable. So for those of you that are familiar with exploratory factor analysis, that's basically what we're doing. Like, it's called principal components analysis. It's a pretty straightforward thing that psychologists do all the time, but economists typically don't. And what we really want to know, like I said, is to understand what questions from that Purdue Ag Economy Barometer, that Consumer Sentiment Index from the University of Michigan, and then this Food and Ag System Sentiment Index questionnaire like looks like over time. The things that we're picking up though is the sentiments most correlated with latent food systems confidence are things like food access, government food and agricultural policies, food price changes, perceptions of farm finance and the ag economy, understanding how people feel about business activities and the general condition of the US economy. Like these are kind of the top 6 things that I would say really are making up this latent variable about the food system based on the pilot data that we've collected. So from here, I originally, when Lawson asked me to give this talk, I thought I would have had multiple months run, but I just moved to the University of Arkansas. So I haven't had a chance to like get it off the ground yet, but we've got it nailed down, the questions at least to start asking. And the hope is to have also ad hoc space so that when we have kind of random, like the toilet paper questions, we can throw it on a survey really quick and get 1,000 observations in a hurry so that we can speak to specific resiliency questions throughout the food system. This is obviously very different from Lawson's talk. I thought that a lot of what Lawson was talking about, small farms, is something I'm working on too. I would love to continue his conversation on top of this one, just because understanding this downstream effect matters. But to me, it matters in so much as it can inform what producers change their behavior based on, if that makes sense. So that's what I got. Thank you all, and open to talk things through.
So what are some of the details in the questions that you find that people really care for, that really track that sentiment? I mean, were there issues that were common across the 3 type of questions that you looked into? And
yeah, I mean, these are the kind of top 5 or top 6 questions or like topics this food access thing I think is really important. And this gets back to my rural restaurant comment. I don't know that we really fully grasp how food access works in the United States. The role of infrastructure in food access in the US, I don't think has been fully explored. So in the long term, I'd love to look more into that. Like if you are closer to, easy transportation options, do you feel better about the food system because you can handle this last mile delivery component of food? I just had a call with Heifer USA, and they have this online platform to sell sustainable produce online, or not produce, sorry, it's mostly protein. But because of A, the sustainability costs, but then B, the last mile delivery component, they're selling whole chickens for like $100 a chicken. And so like that's great for the farmer that's selling that $100 chicken, but like food access is not so great when we're selling $100 chickens. And so, there is this trade-off that has to happen. And I think a lot more rests on this, like Lawson talked about, like 8 cents of the food dollar goes to farmers. It's like 18 cents is pre-farm gate versus 82 cents post-farm gate. I don't think we talk enough about that 82 cents post-farm gate in terms of how people feel about the food system at any given time. And that's infrastructure, that's logistics, that's the stuff that I don't know, that I think the pandemic really emphasized it. But I don't know, at least in my own research work, I'd never really thought enough about it before.
do you have anything there about food safety outbreaks? Or, I mean, those seem to be things that might change some of the sentiment here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, so we should. I wish I'd have gotten it off the ground, because we would have started throwing stuff on about the baby formula. And because that's an example of like people, you want to talk about messing with the trust in the food system. I mean, that's a bad one. So I wish I'd have had it off the ground, because I would be really interested to see people with parents or kids, what did that do to your trust in the food system? And ideally, I think this is why you need to have, from a taxpayer perspective, it makes sense to track this, but also just from like a voter perspective. If people constantly assume that the food system is broken, which they do, what kind of policies might that create versus a world where they say, well, yeah, COVID was crazy. There were empty grocery store shelves, but honestly, I don't know that it proves that the food system is broken by any stretch of the imagination. So I don't know. I would love to start adding food safety questions on and try to get ahead of the food safety concerns over time. I bet you can also pick up differences like in those food safety issues geographically. So, you know, are there isolated areas where all of a sudden you don't trust it anymore because geographically things have changed? Yeah.
Can I ask what your food access question is?
Yeah, it's up here. Looking ahead, now, do you think that a year from now, you and your family living there will have better or worse access to food than you did, or just about the same as now? That's actually modeled off of this consumer sentiment. So part of the goal is also to be able to mirror, because again, I'm really interested in this question of like how much of your overall satisfaction with life can be explained by your satisfaction with your food options and vice versa. Like if people are just unhappy, do they just hate the food system too because they hate everything? Or is how much of it is explained either way?
And a fun fact about that question is that, so we run the 2 pilots and they were, you know, like tracking this, but when we schedule like the full run with all the observations, it was scheduled to be on a Friday. So we were waiting for it. And Thursday evening, the war began.
Yeah.
Ukraine. So that was,
yeah,
like we were bummed when that happened.
We were also bummed for the Ukraine, but
Yeah,
like
yeah.
we were especially,
Yeah.
Yeah, but no, I mean, and that's the hard thing, you know, in extension, it's been really rough because the last like 2 or 3 years, I swear it's like every other month there's a new crisis. And that's why I wish we had something like this so we could see how people are feeling about the world, about our world, our ag and food world over time. Because if you really want people to buy sustainable food and be willing to pay that premium for sustainable food, I think you have to have at least the core baseline necessities taken care of, such as food access or confidence in the food system in general. And without that, it's just really hard for me to imagine that they're going to be willing to double down on purchasing these other products.
I think that question in particular is asking because that seems like an interesting one to point out for like the effects of social media.
Yeah.
And like perception of the access. So that's far more like perception than how we think about it. Food desert.
Yeah. Yeah. And you know, food deserts are obviously this really interesting topic because it gets back to this like logistics and transportation thing, right? Like that's the punchline for a lot of food desert stuff. Like, can you actually get to the place that you get your food? Yeah. Yeah.
You were talking before, I'm wondering if the sustainability, the willingness to buy consumers increase for, let's say, agricultural products, how that will affect the value chain. I'm thinking about the rice example I was talking about before. So let's say if somehow, let's say the government of Costa Rica have the procedure to categorize a productized argument, and then people want to buy more rice that is argumental. How that will affect the entire value chain. And what happened is that most of the processing industry companies are in meat production, rice production. Couple companies manage the entire processing industry.
Mm-hmm.
So let's say if you have a farmer that can produce, let's say, carbonated, or a livestock farmer, right, or a rice farmer. So it goes into the industry, but the industry needs farmers to work at capacity, and they have to mix it with the traditional producers. Right? I'm wondering to know if even if that happens, if you don't have a change, maybe that won't affect anything.
So similarly, in Northwest Arkansas, basically every large company is saying that we're going to be carbon neutral by like 2050 or whatever. There's no like clear way that they're going to do that, but like Walmart says that, Tyson says that, everybody says that. And that to me is like this, it's a statement that they think is just customer driven, but that is going to create, I think, larger and larger ripple effects because It's not necessarily Walmart that's got to be the one to come up with that answer. It's their suppliers and then the ag input producers. And that's what I was saying about the technology adoption and stuff, where like people are coming up with ideas that would be beneficial to Walmart or Tyson or whoever, but the compensation or the expectation for the adoption is down this supply chain. And it's still not abundantly clear to me how financially these two things are going to be motivated without some type of government policy, which is going to be very equitably dangerous. I mean, you talk about technology adoption. So believe it or not, the Walton Family Foundation is pouring money into like local food systems in Northwest Arkansas. So like the Walmart family like really cares about local foods. I know that feels strange to say, but like they really do. And so they just sunk like $5 million into the Center for Ag, like local food production, like small farm production system. And so they're trying to train people in the area to know how to grow specialty crops. And I went to their equipment management day the other day. So like basically they brought all the small farmers in to go look at the new small farm equipment that's on the market. And basically all of the small farm equipment is not something that anybody wants to adopt. It's expensive, it's complicated. It's targeted for small farms, but you know, soil is different everywhere. So like, what are the soils that we're using in Northwest Arkansas? Like, I think there is a massive gap in conversation about small farm technology adoption or the types of technologies that would be beneficial to small farms. You have stuff in the international development literature, like smallholder, you know, farm technology in Africa, like that's a very popular topic, but we have not really breached that gap in the United States. And I think that's another really interesting area for research.
All right, thank you, Trey.
Cool.
Appreciate it.
Thank y'all.
So our last speaker is M. Shuan Park from the University of Arkansas.
Hello, I'm Unchun Park from University of Arkansas, just like Lawson and Trey. Are y'all Arkansas family here? This is collaboration with Sanjay Nan, also from University of Arkansas, and also my wife. And Sang-Hyo Kim is from Korea Rural Economic Institute. And this is mostly done by my wife, Sanjay Nan. She is the main expert of choice experiment, but I'm the co-author. So I know every single things, but I cannot, explain some details about choice experiments. So if I'm wrong, please correct me. So this is the studies for consumers' perception of sustainable food label. So as Lawson and Trey mentioned, University of Arkansas is located at the Northwest Arkansas, which is a Sam's Club and Walmart and big retailers headquarters located at. So our department had a chance to talk with the management board of their Sam's Club, whatever, and the Walmart and Sam's Club, they are very much interested in sustainability. So they talk about this a lot. So we guess that we cannot access to their private information or data, but maybe consumer care about sustainable product. So that's why we just simply do a choice experiment to measure the customer's perception on sustainable food label. That's the starting point. So then what is sustainable product? Maybe we can define as like type of food that are grown in a manner that limits their negative impact on the environment. But for me, it looks very abstract, in fact, the definition, right? So I tried to find out the clear definition of it, but I couldn't find it. So there is no clear definition or no certified definition of the sustainable product or sustainable foods. But as I mentioned before, many private sectors have recently interested in sustainable food and sustainable product label and something like that. If you purchase for some kind of clothes, for instance, you can see that this is cotton, is renewable cotton with sustainable food. And there is some kind of private sector label, not certified one, you can find it, but there is no certified legal definition or label for sustainable food or sustainable product. But on the other hand, we have some certified labels, like USD Organic is certified from United States Department of Agriculture. And also we have some non-GMO product and something like that. That's the clear difference between sustainable food label versus other labels. So the research question is very simple. So first one is, does the sustainable food label matter? We want to do actually the respondents or consumer, they have their preference on the sustainable food label or not. And we, second question is information matter. So we do some kind of information treatment. So we divided two groups of people, and one group of people, we inform the detailed explanation of the label, which label like USD Organic and sustainable food label and something like that. And the other group, we didn't give any information about the label. So that is our information treatment. And we want to see that if there are any difference in preference in sustainable food label with and without information. And the other objective is the consumer's preference for sustainable food follow their actual shopping habits and sustainability. So we imported sustainable food purchasing index like Trey introduced before. It developed from managed by Purdue, and we want to see that if each respondents index matters of their preference on sustainable food label. There are some previous studies. I just picked three of them. The first one is a 2000, I believe, 2015 paper in Ecological Economics. They measure consumers' willingness to pay for sustainability label on coffee. They did some choice experiment, and they use a random primary logic model, and they use some eye tracking sensor to do some extra treatment, but they didn't control any information effect on label, something like that. And another paper is, I believe it's 2014, is in food policy, there is sustainable label. They investigate the relationship between consumers' motivation and understanding, and they categorize two different label type, which is environmentally sustainable label and ethically sustainable label. And they collected online survey data, but there's no econometric analysis. So the way they did is just what type of gender and what type of income prefers this one versus this one. And this is just the collection of information type of survey. And another recent paper is, this is an interesting paper recently published in AAEA, which is new journal of AAEA. They did some information treatment. There are information redundancy in label. For instance, like organic is always non-GMO, but we can see some product has both of label, right? So one group of people, they provide information about this redundancy, and some group of people, they did not provide anything. So they compare their willingness to pay, and they do the field experiment based on BDM mechanism, and they find that information matters, their choices. And we conduct the online survey as a choice experiment for the dairy milk with and without information. So as I mentioned before, one group of people provide information regarding its label, and one does not. So there are four different label here. One is USD Organic, no antibiotics, American grass-fed milk, and the other one is sustainable food. All these three things are already the main existing label, but we artificially create one label here in addition to this. We treat those labels as attribute in addition to the price attribute. So we have 5 attributes in the choice experiment. So after conducting this choice experiment, respondents were asked to answer 18 questions regarding SFP index. So each respondent's index score was measured. And food purchasing SFP index, again, from the Center for Food Demand Analysis and Sustainability, from Purdue, and there are 18 questions with 6 subcomponents of nutrition, environment, social, and economic security, and taste. So it's 5 scale point scale coded 0 to 4. And a lower score indicates the shopping habits are not consistent with sustainability. The important thing is here, this SFP index question doesn't have any wording of sustainability. So they are indirectly measure their shopping habits in indirect questions. So there is no wording of sustainability in their questions. So, okay, we have two group of people, and one group of people informed its labels and conduct choice experiment, and after that they will do this SFP questions. So this is sample example, question. So we have 4 options with non-option. So we have 3 level of prices from 2.5 to 6.5. And we do main effect, orthogonal design, and each respondent have 8 questions. So this is just sample descriptive statistics. This is only preliminary result. So I only got 300 test samples. So the reason why is like, first, we don't have enough time to prepare, to be frank. And second, if we get the great suggestions or ideas, and we can reflect in our actual sample at final caption. So there are a lot of different demographics, but that's the important demographic. That's why I pick it up. So over 93% of people, they already hear about organic label. And among people who know already hear about organic label, almost 80% of people, they know about the definition of organic. But sustainable food, 70% of people hear about sustainable food before. Among the people who already heard about the sustainable food, they think they know about the definition of sustainable food. But I don't know well about the definition of sustainable food. So, but the consumer thinks that they already know about the sustainable definition. So the model is very general random utility model. So its respondents utility is function of its attributes. And again, we have 3 price levels, run random probability lossing model with 500 Hawthorne. We impose normal distribution for its coefficient for labels, and we impose one-sided triangle distribution for price. So all the coefficients are treated as a random probability. And the first regression I did is information regression. This is just information treatment. So we have 2 group of people, and we want to see that their choices and difference in preferences with and without information. And another regression is sustainable purchasing. So we divided 2 group of people based on the median score of the SFP index, and we make a dummy variable for high index score group versus low. We want to see the difference in their preference in each label, compare the low level and high level. So here are the results, and this is information. So in the information treatment regression, we find clear very significant, and the organic is most preferred, and second is grass-fed, and third is no antibiotics. The sustainable food label is least preferred among all other options. And standard deviation show that there are clear heterogeneity in their preferences on organic and no antibiotics and grass-fed, but there is no significant value in sustainable. And with information effect, the treatment, the group, their price information, price coefficient is less negative, which means less sensitive to the no information group. And we only find a standard deviation effect in information group of grass-fed label and the price. So our main interest on sustainable food label, we couldn't find any information effect here. So the group of people who informed or without information, there is no clear difference in their choices of sustainable food label. And another estimation is low versus high SFP index group. Again, we could find there are all the coefficients are significant, and grass-fed is most preferred to low index group, and organic is second, and no antibiotics is third, but still sustainable food label is preferred with low SFP group. And we can clearly see their heterogeneity in their preferences on every single coefficient here. And high index group, their preference on organic and no antibiotics is greater than low score group. And also price is positive, so which means less sensitive to the price compared to the low group. And we could find a significant level of heterogeneity in price coefficient again. But our main interest is on sustainable label here. We also couldn't find any differences in their choices and preferences in sustainable food label. That's what we find so far. So no direct information effect on both. And customers' preference for sustainable label does not follow their shopping habits on sustainability. So low index group, again, their actual shopping habit is more in sustainability, but their actual preference is not on the sustainable label. Maybe results can be changed because we only have 300 samples. So maybe the final result will be changed, but here are the findings we got so far. So one guess is that sustainable food index is more like global things. Like if I have a little daughter, I have 16 months daughter, so I care about dairy milk purchasing. So I care about my daughter rather than whole other words. So sustainable food label, their impression is more like global warming or save the world and something like that, not just for my own benefits or my family's health and benefits. But organic or grass-fed, it feels like more healthier than the other product. I think that kind of preference or perception maybe affect the choices on or preference on sustainable food label. But so far, that's the result I got so far. So, any questions or suggestions? Thank you. Thank you. Yep.
And the thing is that we're saying, okay, we're gonna support farmers on the footprint, greenhouse gas emission footprint. However, we know consumers won't pay for it. They don't care. Maybe they are doing like cost product, right? So the thing is, that is a interesting finding because we know that is true. However, what about if we increase awareness and how we complement our intervention program in farm at the factory level with awareness and at the consumer level, so they can recognize the brand and they can recognize what is sustainable or environmental things. In that sense, we increase the awareness, maybe from the demand side, we can improve that and encourage even more producers to continue getting adopted.
Right.
That is a comment.
Yeah. great comment. Thank you.
I think an interesting follow-up to that is there is the definition you show about sustainability is so broad.
Yeah,
It might not be communicating anything to people. And so what if we had more specific quantifiable things like this product used 10% less water, this product didn't use child labor. I mean, different things that communicate actual factual information that are more tangible for people. As opposed to having something that is so broad that maybe has absolutely no meaning and no bearing on whether you want to pay more or not.
That's great idea. I mean, yeah, maybe we can divide 3 group of people, like no information at all and very broad and vague information about label, and more detailed one. Maybe we could find differences.
And I think that's kind of like the theme of this session here, because unless we have an interesting way to try to start defining, or provide a definition for something that is meaningful,
Right.
we cannot provide that. I think that consumers are just gonna be confused. And people that run the supply chain, like even Walmart, you were saying to a certain degree, they say we want to be more sustainable. But I mean, if you ask them and push them, what does exactly that mean in terms of the metrics and numbers? I don't know that we're there yet. And so this is kind of like the theme, I think, for us to start thinking of a research. What is some of the components that we really want to start creating to see if the consumer cares about nature? Do they care more about the economic sustainability? What are the different aspects within this broad concept that the consumers are more likely to pay attention?
Right.
Like, so one thing, I love word clouds. And I would love to have like a question on a survey, like on your final run, that basically asks like in one word, what is sustainability mean to you? And then just see what the big words are in the word cloud.
Okay.
That's a great idea.
I just think that would be an interesting like data visualization representation of how people are actually thinking about sustainability. The other thing that I've been like preaching this like utility function lately because I think it's super informative. It's in the like political science literature. It's called expressive voting. I don't know if you ever heard of that concept, but it's this idea that every choice has an instrumental component, or like a utility function has an instrumental component and an expressive component. And so when people vote for things that they won't buy, what's happening is they want to say that I'm a pro animal welfare person, but I don't want to pay for it, right? And so that's what happens is the expressive component of being able to brag to my friends that I supported the animal welfare initiative outweighs the instrumental component because I don't have to pay for it if I vote for it. Well, I do, but it's a second order effect. And my decision to purchase something is binding to me. My decision to vote for something is not, because like the probability that my vote is what shapes the outcome of an election is virtually zero. So it's basically like watching a football game on your couch and cheering for your team. You're not actually probably going to change the outcome of the event, but you want to talk about how much you care about that game. And so I wonder with sustainability, if when people use that word, what they're actually trying to emphasize is that I'm a person who likes sustainability in this expressive conversation. But instrumentally, I mean, I'm probably going to put my money in something else, but I want to tell people that I know what sustainability is, even though nobody knows what sustainability is, and 75% of people say they do. But you see what I mean?
Yeah.
So like, I wonder if there's a way to like use that your discrete choice indirect utility function and like nest like that expressive component into it. Does that make sense?
Right.
I think that would be really interesting, just to see how much of this is actually just driven by people wanting to brag about how sustainable they are.
Great, great. Come join this paper.
Yeah. Press the whole.
Questions? Yeah.
One general one, kind of this work, it kind of ties to loss. This kind of back to Iowa. Walmart kind of that's really like the entire of sustainability. It's another part of the appreciate. Really interested in what that is. I'm curious on your thoughts on that type of a thing, and then more of an altruistic thing, perceptions like that, probably directly affect your health. Is better or something like that. But it's really important. I think it's kind of curious on your thoughts on this. Things and whether your results really gives them feels.
Interesting question. So that was I think we talked this issue a few days ago, right? And we strongly believe that if people, I mean, consumers really want to adopt a sustainable food product, and especially for Sam's Club, for instance, Sam's Club is wholesale retailer, so consumers expect low price, right? But they, at the same time, they require, I mean, their perception of sustainable food is increasing, and they prefer sustainable food label or whatever, sustainable food processed food or other product. Then I personally believe that all this kind of burden will deliver to the farm, I guess, because like large wholesale market like Sam's Club has market power, and they everyday low price is their slogan, and their competitive advantage over other retailer is low price, right? And then if consumer matters about the sustainability and sustainable process, all the burden probably deliver to the producers, and that's my personal concern about this sustainable product. Also, maybe I think the government's intervention should be done for this issue, because without having any intervention or incentive programs to adopting to motivate, incentivize program for the producers from government, and all the burdens will be delivered to. That's my personal idea.
I think that the burden is definitely going to shift towards the farm production side of this equation. I think that the cost of that burden is going to be spread through taxpayers, innovators, and potential markets at that end of it. I'm not fully convinced that consumers are going to be willing to pay much.
They can create a lot of fuss.
Yeah,
Very interesting, yeah.
Twitter is going to be on fire, but I don't know if it's going to translate to.
I don't think you're gonna be able to like consumer label away sustainability.
Yeah.
You know, like, you can't just make a label and the next thing you know, we've solved the entire supply chain. But it's, I mean, like, I understand like the hope of being able to pass through the cost to consumers. But again, like if you look at some of the kind of innovative nonprofit groups that are really trying to push into this space, I don't know that they're talking about feeding Sam's Club people. I think they're talking about a different demographic of, and so that's if you want to open that question of like how do the poor people eat, it's a sustainability label plan is not probably going to do it. So the World Wildlife Foundation is also doing a bunch of stuff right now on sustainability. It's super interesting. They just started a pilot project with the Postal Service to do like next day delivery of fresh fruits and vegetables. And the idea is to not have to create a whole new system, but to identify currently existing last mile delivery systems and try to connect the two that way. And like, so I think there's like some really interesting nonprofit work that's going on. But you know, that's a way that you might be able to get like help the poor people eat more, you know, healthier, more sustainable food potentially. But the labeling model is really selling the whole foods and then some, you know.
It's like treating it like organic. Yeah, they're completely different. Completely different problem.
And that's the limitation there is they, if you go that way, then you're gonna end up being a niche.
Yeah, exactly, exactly.
And we
This
want
is
to
a broader
transform
issue.
the entire
Yeah,
production
Mhm.
system.
it's a much broader issue.
Right.
Well, let's thank our three speakers. I think it was a very interesting and thought-provoking session.
Thank you.